We've talked in previous weeks about the housing market, and as I look at the amount of debt that Americans have, you can see that our debt has moved up in tandem with the price of houses. And if you look at inflation over, say, the past decade, I found this out in my research this past week, and I don't have a chart here to show everybody, but we've said inflation is about 2%. But if you include the price of rent, if you include the cost of your mortgage payment, it's actually gone up 5% every year. We've had 5% inflation, but we don't count the cost of living. That is, we don't count your rent. And why not? Because we have this idea that it's okay if the price of televisions go down. The price of clothing has gone down over the past century. The price of cars has gone down over the past 50 years. But the price of houses has always gone up. There's been a few corrections, usually minor. We had a big one in 2008, but we just take it for granted that it is normal and economically healthy for the price of houses to go up and up and up. And I've been thinking like this is wrong. The the price of a house in 1950, we threw this out the past couple episodes because I want to keep hitting it because I want people to understand. The price of a house in 1950 was twice the typical salary about. Today it's 5 times. So the price of a house in real terms is 2.5 times what it was in 1950. That's insane. And what that does is it locks in people who own real estate as being the winners, the incumbents, and people who are new entrants to the market have a hard time getting in. And this has affected millennials. Boomers are doing okay, but millennials are having a really hard time buying their first house. And so that doesn't strike me as a really healthy growth model. And I said, why is this? Because again, we have
Well,
all
Pete,
these examples. Yeah.
I have a question for you because we
Okay.
have talked about this several times, and I've
Yeah.
had some time to think about it. And I
Sure.
actually reached out to a friend of mine who does real estate, and
Okay.
it's funny because his attitude is very much what you. It's very much the attitude of the people that I think you're railing against, and he's kind of a great example of it. Maybe sometime I'll try to get him on the show just to give his perspective. But he very much is in that mode of the sky is the limit. And even if you look at the 2008 crash, which of course was caused by the housing bubble, he's like, well, look at where we're at now, and look how it recovered and it's gone up and all that kind of stuff. But my question
Right.
is, and this was kind of my question to him, isn't this an indication of inflation? That's my question. Isn't this an indication of inflation, of real inflation? Because you talked about things like cars and clothes. And the reason the cost of cars and clothes has been able to go down is because of manufacturing and because it gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper to make this stuff. But
Right.
what do you think as far as the effect of inflation, and that perhaps what we're seeing in the housing market is a reflection of where we're really at and how bad inflation really is?
Well, first of all, this is inflation, whether he agrees or not. This is inflation, and it's specifically a type of inflation called acid inflation. When we hit a crash like we hit in 2000 or 2008, what happens is we start pumping a lot of liquidity into the market. And we've seen the same thing with the Federal Reserve and also with just the profligate fiscal policy at the federal level, where we've suddenly cut everybody $1,200 checks. Right now, we've seen the federal debt, the national debt, go from 22 trillion to, well, really 23 trillion to almost 25 trillion overnight. We've seen it go up by $2 trillion in the past few months. And according to Andy Biggs, who is the congressman out of Arizona, he's the head of the Freedom Caucus, and he's a real budget hawk. He has been outspoken saying we're going to see the national debt will be $30 trillion by the end of the year. $30 trillion. So we've gone from 22 trillion to $30 trillion in a single year. We will, if we don't correct course at this point. And that doesn't seem sustainable to me. So as far as inflation, the reason why you don't see, say, the price of a gallon of milk going up the way you do the price of houses is two reasons. One, the government is very invested in propping up the price of houses. Every city council uses their zoning power to restrict the number of houses, and the at the national level, you have monetary policy which is geared towards inflating this asset bubble. And what happens is the boomers, who are the incumbents, they say, well, I feel richer because I have all this equity in my house, and when I retire, I'm going to sell my house and I'm going to go to the suburbs or the exurbs or whatever, and I'm going to live on that money that I earned from owning a house all those years. But that's just a Ponzi scheme, because that house isn't a productive asset. Imagine if, instead of having all of Americans invest their disposable income into their houses twice as much as they did 70 years ago, two and a half times actually. Imagine if more Americans were putting that money into American manufacturing, putting it into the stock market, so that way startups, American artificial intelligence companies, or whatever it is, whatever the next frontier of investment and technological innovation is, put your money there. But instead, we tell people to put their money into dead assets that aren't producing any value. That house depreciates, but the money is worth more because we have this hub and spoke model where everybody's expected to work in the center of town, in the downtown area, and then you live in the suburbs. And the suburbs get bigger and bigger as that inner ring expands over the years, and all the value is at the center of the town. But that's not sustainable. If you look at a city like San Francisco or New York City, where commutes are ridiculously long. I have never lived in Silicon Valley, but I've had a lot of coworkers where I'll work in one city and they'll be in New York City or they'll be in San Francisco, and they'll tell me, "Oh, I have to live 2 hours away from my office, and so I don't leave the house until 10. I telecommute from 7 to 10 or whatever the time frame is. I put in 4 hours at the office, and then I drive back before rush hour hits, because otherwise I wouldn't be able to afford my rent." And these are guys who are IT professionals. Okay, they're earning well into six figures. They might be earning $150,000, $200,000 a year, and they can't afford a house. That isn't sustainable. That doesn't make sense. And we've talked a lot about how a lot of these people should be telecommuting 100% of the time anyway, because but the other thing that we should be doing is getting away from this hub and spoke model when we do central planning, or I should say city planning, which is a kind of central planning, unfortunately. When we do city planning, we should be, and this is where I want to talk about strong towns, and I'll talk about it more over the coming weeks as I'm reading more and more. It's a really fascinating theory that the cities that work the best are the cities that have avoided this hub and spoke model. New York and San Francisco are sort of at a breaking point. It's worked okay for them because they have, New York has the financial sector and San Francisco has the IT sector. But the cities, what about everybody else who doesn't have something like that? They don't have Hollywood the way that LA does, for example. Well, the cities that work the best are the ones where you have distributed growth. So the Phoenix area, I think, approximates that somewhat, where you have downtown Phoenix, you have downtown Mesa, you have downtown Chandler, but you can live and work fairly. Your commute doesn't have to be 2 or 3 hours. You don't have people in Phoenix, for the most part, commuting 2 or 3 hours like you do in the Bay Area. Because if you live in Chandler, you can also work in Chandler. You have Wells Fargo, you have Intel, you have a lot of Fortune 500 companies right in Chandler, Arizona. On the other hand, you have bedroom communities like Gilbert, Arizona, where you don't have a lot of jobs because people are worried about the traffic. And I think that's going to blow up in their faces. And I've told the people who are running for city
By the
council.
way, when it comes to bedroom community, I don't think anybody beats Mesa. I remember this was years ago. I remember there was a talk I remember years and years ago where they were saying what's sort of a decent economic model for a typical city, and it was something like at least 70, basically having at least enough jobs for 70% of your population. That was the number that was thrown to me. Okay, that was basically if you can employ about 70% of your people, if you have enough jobs in your city to do that, you're in good shape. At the time, now this was years ago. At the time, Mesa was like at 30%. they had they had enough jobs for 30% of their people. And the biggest employer in Mesa at the time, and I think to this day, was the Mesa School District, which is the largest school district in Arizona, which really tells you something. So,
Yeah,
and I think,
and
and I
yeah,
think the biggest independent private employer was Walmart. There are Walmarts everywhere in Mesa,
right.
and at the same time, they also have, McDonnell Douglas is in Mesa. You know what I mean? That's where they build the Apache helicopter.
Right.
But that's not where most people are employed. So it's kind of interesting when you talk about this issue of the spoke and the wheel, because what happened in a lot of communities in the Phoenix metro area, and this is not this happened in many other communities as well, is there was actually intense neglect of their downtowns. Intense neglect. Mesa is a great example. Downtown Mesa is there's almost nothing there, except for the Mesa Art Center and the Convention Center, which is very small. There's almost nothing in downtown Mesa. So in terms of this spoken wheel that you're talking about, many communities out here had intense neglect of their downtowns. And Chandler's a good example. Phoenix is a good example of these places where there's been a revitalization of their downtowns, as opposed to say Tempe that has had a pretty robust downtown for decades, and also Scottsdale has had a robust downtown for decades as well. But they're based more on the social model of bars and restaurants and things like that, as opposed to, well, now in Tempe you're seeing a lot of office space go up. So it's kind of interesting because on the one hand, it's I think a lot of what you're saying is absolutely on the mark when you're talking about places like New York and you're talking about places like San Francisco. But there is another side to this of many cities that their downtowns have been in complete neglect for decades, and only in say the last 10 years or so have we seen a revitalization of their downtowns, which are actually fueled, as far as I can tell, by urban living. A lot of people like the idea of living in a high rise. They like the idea of having a loft. You know what I mean? That's where I'm seeing a
Yes.
lot of the growth in downtown places.
Right. And that's, that's really good. It can be good depending on exactly how it's done. And there's a lot of factors here. But being able to walk around your neighborhood is a really big deal. And there should be parks within walking distance. There should be restaurants and perhaps bars. And, we can talk exactly about what your downtown should look like. But a lot of people are worried about crime and they're worried about traffic. But think about Arizona. The biggest problem with Arizona is as far as just sort of social, the social aspect and the city planning aspect of it is that people don't know their neighbors. There's no real sense of community in a lot of neighborhoods. And that's because people can't walk around. If you're going to go to the store, you go to Walmart or you go to a big box store. And if you want to go to a restaurant, you go to a chain restaurant. And it's going to be at a strip mall and it's not going to be that close. The strong towns model is very critical of that because these big boxes, first of all, they're built cheaply. Those buildings don't last forever. Whereas a strong downtown, typically these are buildings that will last a long time. These are businesses. Think of downtown Chandler. I don't know if you've been. You have Saba's Western Wear, for example, down there. Down there, it's kind of a kooky little. Um, it is a chain, but it's a local chain, and you get the sense that this is going to be here for a long time. You look at the businesses around there, they're not planning to move out. Whereas Walmart, they'll move in, their building will be ready to demolish in 20 years, 20, 25 years, and then they move on. And your city then loses that anchor, and you start seeing blight. And economically, it's not good. The city has a you collect less in taxes, in sales taxes from an area like that over the long term, and so it's just a lose lose for the city. People think that the big box model of growth is going to work, but it's just a way of sort of kicking the can down the road. It assumes you're just going to get more and more people coming in to pay taxes because, oh, you have a Walmart. That's what people used to say about malls. And who goes to malls anymore, especially with COVID? But even before that, even a year ago, I was reading, and we've been reading this for years, that something like 75% of malls are expected to close in the coming years because it doesn't make sense. It's not really a good shopping experience. It doesn't foster a sense of community because it's just so cookie cutter. You could be anywhere in the country and the mall would look exactly the same. And is that what builds a community over time? It absolutely isn't. And the so the, to tie this all together, if we had a more distributed model, there would be a lot of benefits. Part of it would be resilience when you have an economic downturn because people are more invested in your city. It's not like Walmart where they're ready to pick up sticks as soon as things get tough. And what we find is that the more distributed old time main street, like if you think of how Mayberry looked in the old TV show, the Andy Griffith show, that our idea of Main Street turns out to be the best way to build a city, according to the data. And I'm going to bring this out over the coming weeks because it's a really exciting theory, but we've already gone over time on this. So I would just sort of wrap this up by saying uh, we have a lot of things in our economy right now that are built up as Ponzi schemes that are built up as the sort of boomer idea of the population is going to continue to explode and other people will buy our house. So there'll be 5 people in the future who want to buy our house. And so we'll make a huge profit off of it. And boy, that gravy train is never going to run dry. And we're at the point where the next generation cannot buy houses. And that tells me we are at the breaking point. If you want to know why Bernie Sanders, and I have talked about this to a degree, why is Bernie Sanders so popular? I think a lot of people are mistaken. They think that the young people just want free stuff, and I think okay, yeah, that's probably a part of it. But I think the bigger part of it is that the older generation talks capitalism, but what they actually practice is an unsustainable growth model that excludes young people. And so young people say, well, if capitalism, as it's practiced, the sort of crony capitalism, infinite growth pyramid scheme model doesn't work, and that's their idea of capitalism because that's what we're doing, then maybe give socialism a try. And I think the older generation has done the younger generation a great disservice by not thinking ahead, by following really irresponsible policy on Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, spending in general. And now the chickens are coming home to roost.
Yeah, uncontrolled spending is definitely a problem. And to kind of get back to
Yeah,
my earlier question, I think this is what also causes this inflation effect. It's
right.
the major cause of this inflation effect.
Yeah, and I want to hit that point really well. Right now, we are seeing deflation because a lot of loans are going to go bad. A lot of people who they took out loans to support their business. Those are going to go away. People are going to default on their mortgages. People are going to default on their business loans. People are going to default on a lot of credit. And that by definition is deflation. And so we're going to see deflation. We're going to see the price of houses go down. We've already seen the price of oil collapse. We're going to see other assets, other commodities go down, and that is asset deflation. And then we're going to see asset inflation again because the Federal Reserve and Congress are going to pump as much money into the economy as they can because they don't want the Ponzi scheme to be exposed. They don't want a lot of these bad investments to go bad. They want to keep the hamster wheel going just a little bit longer until maybe they retire from office so that they don't get blamed. But right now, we're seeing the head of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, has said this is the worst economy in US history. And we're all sitting around saying, well, things are going to be fine in the fall. Everything's going to turn around. And I don't think so. I think this time we're not going to just spend and inflate our way out of this mess. I think we're actually going to have to deal with this in a real way. And to a large degree, it is the old against the young. It is the millennials versus the boomers. And I think the boomers need to wise up that they cannot continue to go along with the status quo, to make the same bad decisions they've made their entire political lives, because it is hurting our country. It hasn't led to a sustainable, healthy growth model, and it has to end.